The air inside the Golden Dragon restaurant was thick enough to choke a man. It did not smell like the expensive steak or the aged wine on the table. It smelled like fear. Park Min-jae sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his sharp black suit blending into the shadows of the dim room. He was a man who had built an empire out of silence and steel, and tonight, his silence was the loudest thing in the room. His hands, which had signed off on the fate of hundreds, were folded neatly in front of him. Around him sat his lieutenants, men who wore the same expensive clothes but lacked the same cold soul. They were nervous. They knew that when Min-jae called a late-night meeting, someone usually didn't go home. "He was like a brother to me," Min-jae said finally, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He wasn't looking at his men. He was staring at a single candle flickering in the center of the table. "I gave him everything. I gave him a seat at this table. And how does he pay me? By selling our secrets to the police." One of the lieutenants, a man named Jeong with a scar running through his eyebrow, leaned forward. "The evidence is clear, boss," Jeong whispered, his eyes darting around. "He met with the detectives twice this week. If we don't act now, we are all dead men." The other men nodded quickly, their faces pale in the candlelight. They were pushing for blood, and in Min-jae's world, blood was the only way to fix a mistake. Min-jae felt a strange weight in his chest. For years, he had operated on one simple rule: loyalty is everything. If someone broke that trust, they had to be removed like a cancer. But something about the reports didn't feel right. He looked at the faces of the men surrounding him. They were eager. They were too eager. It reminded him of the hyenas he had seen in nature shows, always waiting for the lion to grow old or make a wrong move. He wondered if he was still the lion, or if he had become just another businessman who forgot what it meant to really know his people. The restaurant was empty except for his personal staff and the bodyguards standing like statues by the door. Min-jae felt the coldness of the room seeping into his bones. He had everything, the money, the power, the respect, but he felt more alone than he ever had as a young boy in the countryside. Back then, life was hard, but people were honest. Here, the suits were sharp, but the hearts were jagged. He reached for his tea, wanting to wash away the bitter taste of betrayal, but the cup was empty. He didn't even have to look up to know that a server was approaching. He didn't care who it was. He just wanted his drink so he could finish this business and give the order to end a life. Jeong placed a folder on the table. "The hit is set for midnight, boss. We just need your word." Min-jae's finger hovered over the folder. One nod, and a man he once called a friend would be gone forever. The atmosphere was lethal, the kind of heavy quiet that happens right before a storm breaks. The lieutenants held their breath, waiting for the king to speak. They didn't notice the elegant woman in the black and white uniform stepping into the light of the candle. They didn't see the way she looked at the folder, or the way her eyes stayed calm while everyone else's were filled with greed. Min-jae felt the presence of the waitress at his shoulder, but he kept his eyes on the lieutenants, his mind spinning with the dark choices of his life. He was ready to be the monster everyone expected him to be. He was ready to let the last bit of his heart turn to stone. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the soft sound of tea being poured. Min-jae felt the warmth of the steam against his cheek as the waitress leaned in. He expected her to fill his cup and vanish back into the shadows like a ghost, just as every other servant did. But instead of moving away, she stayed. He could feel the eyes of his lieutenants sharpening, their hands moving instinctively toward the inside of their suit jackets where their weapons were hidden. To them, any person who stayed too long was a threat. Then, the world seemed to stop. "Cilia Hamida, Bozu. Onol Gianik Tukbile Menyunyo?" The woman whispered. The words were not just Korean. They were spoken in the deep, rolling dialect of a tiny fishing village hundreds of miles away from the bright lights of Seoul. It was the Satori of Min-jae's childhood, a way of speaking he hadn't heard since he stood at the docks as a young boy, watching his mother repair fishing nets. It was a language of salt, hard work, and old-fashioned honor. Hearing it here, in this cold den of thieves, was like seeing a flower grow through a crack in a concrete floor. The clatter of silverware stopped instantly. Jeong dropped his fork, the metal ringing against the china plate like a bell. The other associates half rose from their chairs, their faces twisted in confusion and anger. They didn't understand the words, but they understood that a line had been crossed. A waitress, an outsider, was speaking the private tongue of their leader. "Who told you to speak?" Jeong growled, his hand gripping the edge of the table. He looked at the other men, giving them a silent signal to get ready to drag her away. They moved like hungry wolves, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor as they prepared to silence her for the crime of being noticed. But Min-jae didn't move. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyes were wide with a shock he couldn't hide. He looked at Chioma, really looked at her, for the first time. She didn't look like a spy or a killer. She looked calm. Her back was straight, and her eyes held a spark of boldness that reminded him of the women from his village. Women who weren't afraid of the stormy sea or the men who tried to bully them. As Daesham reached out to grab Chioma's arm, Min-jae finally found his voice. He didn't shout, but his tone was like a blade of ice. "Stay your hands," Min-jae said, raising a single hand in the air. The lieutenants froze. They looked at their boss as if he had grown a second head. They were used to him being the first person to demand a punishment for any mistake. They expected him to be insulted, but instead, he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost from a past he thought he had buried forever. Min-jae ignored his men completely. He turned his chair slightly to face Chioma. The lethal atmosphere of the room was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer about a hit or a traitor. It was about the impossible sound of a home he had forgotten. He looked into her eyes and spoke back to her in that same rough, rural dialect, his voice trembling just enough for only her to hear. "How do you know that song?" he asked. "How do you speak the language of my people?" Chioma didn't flinch at the angry men or the dark room. She simply adjusted her apron and looked at the powerful mafia boss with a look of pure composure. The secret she carried was about to change everything. And for the first time in 20 years, Min-jae felt like he was no longer sitting at a table of liars. He was finally listening to the truth. Min-jae stood up from the table, his chair making a sharp noise against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent restaurant. He looked at his lieutenants, who were still frozen in their seats. And then he looked at Chioma. His face was a mask of cold stone, but his mind was racing like a leaf in a storm. He needed answers that could not be shared in front of men who lived for gossip and blood. He gave a small tilt of his head toward the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the room. "With me," he said. It wasn't a request. Chioma followed him without a word of protest. Her footsteps were quiet and steady. She didn't look back at the angry men behind her, and she didn't look down at the floor in fear. Min-jae led her into a small, private office filled with the smell of old paper and expensive tobacco. He shut the door and locked it with a soft click. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp on a large desk, which made the shadows in the corners seem deeper. Min-jae turned around and leaned against the door. He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to look as tall and scary as possible. He wanted to regain the control he had lost at the dinner table. He stared at her, trying to see if she would blink or shake. But she stood in the center of the room as if she were waiting for a bus. Her calm was starting to make him even more nervous. "Who are you working for?" Min-jae demanded. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was hard and sharp. "Did the Kims send you? Did the police find someone who looks like a waitress, but speaks like a ghost from my village? Tell me the truth before I lose my patience." He stepped toward her, into the circle of light from the lamp. He felt like he was back on the streets, dealing with a rival who had hidden a knife behind their back. In his world, a person who knew your secrets was usually a person who wanted to kill you. He had spent 20 years learning that everyone had a price, and every kindness was a trap. He couldn't understand how a woman who looked so different from him could sound exactly like the people he grew up with, unless it was a trick. "I am not a spy, boss," Chioma said. Her voice was still smooth, but there was a touch of sadness in it now. "I am just a woman who heard men plotting to kill an innocent person while I was trying to serve tea. I did not choose to know your language today. I have known it almost my whole life." Min-jae laughed, but it was a dry, hollow sound. "You expect me to believe that? My village is a tiny speck on the map. Most people in Korea don't even speak that dialect anymore. And yet here you are, in the middle of this city, speaking it perfectly. Who coached you? Who told you about the docks and the way we pronounce our vowels?" He moved closer until he was just a foot away from her. He could see the reflection of the lamp in her eyes. He was looking for a flicker of a lie, a sign that she was reciting a script written by his enemies. He wanted to believe she was a threat because that was a problem he knew how to solve. If she was just a waitress, then the world was much more complicated than he wanted it to be. Chioma didn't back away. She looked him right in the eye, and for a second, Min-jae felt like he was the one being interrogated. No one coached me, Mr. Park, she said, using his real name instead of his title. The person who taught me to speak wasn't a spy. She was an old woman who lived in a small apartment with a young girl who had no one else. She didn't teach me so I could trick a mafia boss. She taught me so I would never forget where she came from. Min-jae stayed silent, his breath hitching in his throat. He had come into this room expecting to break a spy. But he was starting to feel like he was the one being broken. He wanted to keep shouting, to demand names and dates. But the way she said the word home in his dialect felt too real to be a fake. He realized he didn't even know her name. Yet she had seen right through his expensive suit to the scared boy he used to be. Tell me everything, Min-jae whispered, his anger finally starting to fade into a strange, painful curiosity. If you aren't working for them, then tell me who you are. Min-jae stood in the quiet office, his heart beating fast as he waited for Chioma to speak. He had spent his life surrounded by people who lied for a living, but the look in this woman's eyes was different. It was soft but strong, like the moonlight on the sea back home. Chioma took a slow breath and looked at the single lamp on the desk. The light cast long shadows on the walls, making the room feel small and safe. Like a secret box hidden away from the dangerous men in the next room. I grew up in a part of this city where people are often forgotten, Chioma began. Her voice was steady. But there was a warmth in it that made Min-jae feel like he was listening to a story by a campfire. My parents passed away when I was very young. I didn't have any aunts or uncles to take me in. I was just a little girl with a suitcase and a lot of fear. But then, I met a woman named Mrs. Park. Everyone in our building called her Halmoni. At the mention of the word Halmoni, the Korean word for grandmother, Min-jae felt a sharp pang in his chest. He remembered his own grandmother, a woman with hands that smelled like ginger and eyes that crinkled when she laughed. He hadn't thought about her in years. He had pushed those memories deep down so he could be the cold leader his business required. Halmoni was a Korean immigrant who had lost her own family during the hard years, Chioma continued. She lived in the apartment next to mine. She saw me sitting on the stairs one day, crying because I was hungry and lonely. She didn't ask me any questions. She just took my hand and led me into her kitchen. She fed me warm soup and told me that as long as she was alive, I would never be alone again. She became my mother, my teacher, and my best friend. Min-jae leaned closer, his arms dropping to his sides. He forgot for a moment that he was a mafia boss. He forgot about the guns and the money. He was just a man listening to a story about a kindness he didn't think existed anymore. But why the language? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why did she teach a young girl from the city to speak like a fisherman from the coast? Chioma smiled, and it was the first time Min-jae saw a hint of joy in her face. Halmoni used to say that language is the home of the soul. She told me that even if you lose your house, your land, or your money, no one can ever take your words away from you. She missed her home every single day. She spoke to me in her dialect because she wanted to hear the sounds of her childhood. She wanted to keep her memories alive through me. We spent every evening together, sitting on her old sofa, practicing the way the words should sound. She told me stories of the sea, the salty air, and the people who worked hard with their hands. Chioma looked directly at Min-jae. She taught me that how we speak shows who we really are. She told me that people who speak our dialect are bound by honor. They look out for each other. They don't hurt the innocent, and they never forget a kindness. She raised me to be a woman of my word, just like the people from your village. Min-jae felt a lump in his throat. He looked at his expensive watch and his silk tie. He realized that while he had been building his empire, he had lost his soul. He had forgotten the lessons of his own Halmoni. He had become a man who used words to threaten and destroy, while this woman used them to remember and love. He saw now that Chioma wasn't a spy sent to trick him. She was a reminder of the man he was supposed to be. She passed away 5 years ago, Chioma said softly. But before she went, she made me promise to always help people when I could. She told me that our language is a bridge. Tonight, when I heard those men at your table talking about hurting an innocent man, I knew I had to use that bridge. I didn't do it to be brave. I did it because Halmoni was watching, and I couldn't let her down. The room was completely silent. Min-jae looked at Chioma and saw not a waitress, but a guardian of his own history. He realized that the traitor his men wanted to kill might actually be someone worth saving. He looked at the locked door, knowing that the hyenas were still waiting outside. But for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he had to do. The cold stone in his heart was finally starting to melt. Min-jae stood very still, his shadow stretching across the office floor like a dark stain. He looked at the folder on his desk, the one filled with evidence against the man he was supposed to kill tonight. For the first time, the folder felt heavy, as if it were filled with lead instead of paper. He looked back at Chioma, who was still standing calmly in the dim light. Her voice had brought back memories of the sea and his grandmother. But now he needed her to tell him the truth about the present. "You said he is innocent," Min-jae said, his voice low and raspy. "How can you be so sure?" "My men, the ones I have trusted for years, say he is a rat. They say he is talking to the police to tear everything I built down to the ground." Chioma stepped closer to the desk, her expression serious. "Because a man who risks his life for a stranger does not have the heart of a traitor," she said. 3 months ago, a fire broke out in the small grocery store my family owns. It was late at night, and the building was old. The flames moved fast, and I was trapped in the back room. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see my own hands. Min-jae listened, his eyes locked on hers. He knew the man she was talking about. His name was Jeong. Jeong had been his right-hand man for a decade, a person who never complained and always did his job. "I thought I was going to die," Chioma continued. "But then, the door was kicked open. A man ran through the fire. He didn't have a mask or special gear. He just had a wet jacket over his head. He pulled me out of the building just seconds before the roof fell in. He stayed with me until the ambulance arrived, making sure I was safe. He didn't ask for money. He didn't even tell me his name. But I saw his face clearly in the light of the fire." She pointed toward the folder on the desk. "Later, I saw that man with your associates. I recognized him immediately. I started asking questions in the neighborhood. People told me he works for you, but they also told me he is the one who keeps the peace. When the younger thugs try to bully the shopkeepers or take too much money, Jeong is the one who stops them. He told me once that he does it because he remembers what it's like to have nothing." Min-jae felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He remembered Jeong coming to a meeting 3 months ago with bandages on his arms and singed eyebrows. Jeong had claimed he had an accident with a kitchen stove. Min-jae had laughed it off back then, but now he realized his friend had been out saving lives while Min-jae was busy counting profits. "Your lieutenants hate him, Mr. Park," Chioma said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They hate him because he has honor. They want him gone so they can do whatever they want to this neighborhood without him standing in their way. They aren't trying to protect you. They are trying to isolate you so they can take your seat." Min-jae looked at the door. He could almost hear the muffled voices of Daesham and the others in the dining room, probably laughing about how easy it was to trick their boss. He realized that Chioma was giving him a test of honor. Jeong had saved a life that belonged to the woman who carried Min-jae's own history in her words. It was a circle of loyalty that his lieutenants were trying to break with their lies. "He saved the granddaughter of a woman from my village," Min-jae whispered to himself. In the old way of his people, that meant Min-jae owed Jeong a debt that could never truly be repaid. To kill him now would be the greatest sin a man could commit. It would be spitting on the memory of his grandmother and the very language he spoke. Min-jae reached out and picked up the folder. With one quick motion, he ripped it in half and threw the pieces into the trash can. He felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer just a boss following a report. He was a man who saw the truth. "They think I am a fool," Min-jae said, a dark glint appearing in his eyes. He straightened his suit jacket and checked the watch on his wrist. It was almost time for the hit to happen. "They think they can use my own rules to make me kill the only honest man I have left." He turned to Chioma. "You have done more for me tonight than any of those men have done in 10 years. You reminded me who I am. Now, I need you to stay in this room. Lock the door. No matter what you hear, do not come out until I come back to get you." Chioma nodded, her face showing no fear, only a quiet respect. "Be careful, Mr. Park. Hyenas are most dangerous when they think the lion is sleeping." Min-jae gave her a small, sharp nod, the kind of nod a soldier gives before a battle. He turned and walked toward the door, his heart no longer cold, but burning with a quiet, controlled rage. He was going back to the table. But the man returning wasn't the one who had left. The Dragon of the West was awake, and he was ready to protect his own. Min-jae stepped out from behind the velvet curtains and walked back into the dining room. The air was still cold, but he felt a new kind of heat burning in his chest. He moved slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the floor like a ticking clock. As he approached the long mahogany table, his lieutenants straightened up. They tried to look busy or serious, but to Min-jae, they looked like guilty children caught in a lie. He sat back down at the head of the table, his face as calm as a frozen lake. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he picked up his teacup and took a slow sip. Over the rim of the cup, he watched them. He was using a new lens now, one polished by the words of the waitress in the other room. He looked at Daesham, the man with the scar who had been so eager to kill Jeong. Daesham was tapping his fingers on the table. It was a small, fast movement. In the past, Min-jae might have thought it was just energy. Now he saw it for what it was, nerves. Daesham was waiting for the word that would start a murder, and he was terrified his trick might fail. "You all seem very sure about Jeong," Min-jae said softly. His voice was smooth, but it carried a hidden edge. "We are boss," Daesham said quickly. Too quickly. He didn't look Min-jae in the eye. He looked at Min-jae's silk tie instead. The evidence in that folder doesn't lie. He is a danger to us all. Every minute he breathes is a minute we are at risk. Min-jae noticed the way the other men at the table glanced at Daesham. They weren't looking for leadership, they were looking for a cue. They moved their eyes in tiny, jerky motions. One man was sweating despite the cool air of the restaurant. Another was gripping his napkin, so hard his knuckles were white. These were the subtle cues of deception that Min-jae had been too blind to see before. He realized his viper's nest was full of men who had stopped being loyal a long time ago. They had become a pack of wolves, and they were trying to trick the head of the pack into killing his only true friend. "Jeong has been with me since the beginning," Min-jae mused, swirling the tea in his cup. "He is a man of honor. He is a man who knows our language and our ways. It is hard to believe he would throw that all away for a few dollars from the police." "People change, boss," another lieutenant added, his voice shaking just a little. "Money makes people forget where they came from." Min-jae almost laughed. The irony was so sharp it hurt. These men were talking about forgetting where they came from. Yet they were the ones who had forgotten the meaning of Jeong, the bond that holds people together. They were the ones who had traded the honor of their heritage for power and greed. He looked at their expensive suits and their greedy eyes and felt a wave of disgust. They were vipers, hiding behind smiles and bows, waiting for the right moment to strike. He thought about the fire Chioma had described. He thought about Jeong running into the flames to save a stranger while these men sat in safety, plotting their next betrayal. The contrast was so clear now. Jeong was the soul of his organization, and these men were the rot. They wanted to cut out the soul so the rot could spread even faster. "The hit is supposed to happen at midnight, right?" Min-jae asked, leaning forward. The light from the candle made his eyes glow with a dangerous light. "Yes, boss." "Everything is ready," Daesham replied, a tiny, greedy smile touching his lips. He thought he had won. He thought the dragon was still sleeping, following his lead like a puppet on a string. Min-jae leaned back and let out a slow breath. He could feel the weight of the gun in his shoulder holster. But he didn't reach for it yet. He wanted them to feel safe for just a little longer. He wanted them to believe their lie was working. The biggest moment of tension was coming. And when it did, he would make sure the vipers didn't have anywhere to hide. He looked at the empty seat where Jeong should have been and made a silent promise to his old friend. Tonight, the lies would end, and the honor of the Satori would be restored. The dining room felt colder than before. Daesham leaned over the table, his eyes darting toward the back room where Chioma was hiding. He didn't look like a loyal soldier anymore. He looked like a man who was trying to cover up a messy mistake. He cleared his throat, and the sound was like dry leaves scraping on a sidewalk. The other men watched him, their faces tight with worry. They knew that if a waitress had heard their plans, their lives were in danger. "Boss," Daesham whispered, his voice shaking just a little. "We have a problem that is bigger than Jeong now. That woman, the waitress. She heard everything. She heard names, times, and places. We cannot let her walk out of this building with those secrets." Min-jae didn't answer. He just stared at the tea leaves at the bottom of his cup. He felt the anger building in his chest, but he kept his face as still as a statue. He wanted to see how far these vipers would go. He wanted to see if they had even a shred of the honor Chioma had talked about. "She is just a girl from the neighborhood," another lieutenant added, trying to sound brave. "But she knows too much. If she goes to the police, or even if she just talks to the wrong people, our whole operation is finished. You taught us that we must be careful, boss." You taught us that loose ends get people killed. Min-jae looked up slowly. And what do you suggest we do with a loose end like her? He asked. His voice was so quiet that the men had to lean in to hear him. Daesham took a deep breath. He thought he saw a chance to prove his loyalty. We have to take care of it, boss. Right now. Before we leave this restaurant. We can make it look like an accident, or she can just disappear. It's the only way to be safe. It's business. You've said it 1,000 times. Business comes before feelings. The other men nodded in agreement. They were pressuring their leader to kill the very person who had just saved his soul. They were asking him to murder the woman who carried the language of his mother and the memories of his home. To them, Chioma was just a witness to be erased. They couldn't see the bridge she had built. They only saw a threat to their own greedy plans. Is that what you think? Min-jae asked, his eyes turning into dark slits. You think my business is so weak that it can be destroyed by a waitress? Or are you just afraid of what she might have heard you say when you thought I wasn't listening? Daesham flinched as if he had been slapped. No, boss. That's not it at all. We're just looking out for you. We want to make sure the hit on Jeong goes smoothly. We want to make sure your empire stays strong. Min-jae stood up slowly. He looked at each man at the table, one by one. He saw the cowardice in their eyes and the sweat on their brows. They were pushing for a final order. A command to spill more innocent blood to hide their own lies. They thought they could force his hand by using his own rules against him. You talk about my empire, Min-jae said, his voice starting to rise like a gathering storm. But an empire built only on fear and dead witnesses is just a graveyard. You want me to give the order to end her life? You want me to finish what you started with your lies? The lieutenants looked at each other, confused by the change in their boss. They expected a cold yes. They expected him to be the monster they had helped create. They didn't know that the man standing before them was no longer just the dragon of the West. He was a man who remembered the salty air of the docks and the kindness of a woman named Halmoni. Wait here, Min-jae commanded. He didn't look back as he walked toward the back room. The tension in the restaurant was so high it felt like the air might catch fire. The lieutenants sat in the dark, waiting for a death sentence they thought was coming for the girl, never realizing that the judgment was actually coming for them. The door to the private office swung open, and Min-jae stepped back into the dining room. He wasn't alone. Chioma walked behind him, her head held high. The lieutenants all stood up at once, their hands disappearing into their jackets. They thought the boss was bringing the witness out to be finished. Daesham stepped forward, a cold, hungry look in his eyes. He reached for his waistband, ready to show how loyal he could be by doing the dirty work himself. I'll handle this for you. Boss, Daesham growled, his hand beginning to pull a heavy black pistol from his holster. But Min-jae was faster than anyone expected. In one smooth motion, he stepped in front of Chioma and threw a heavy glass ashtray from a nearby table. It struck Daesham's hand with a sickening crack, sending the gun skittering across the floor. Before the other men could react, Min-jae was on them. He didn't use a gun. He used the raw, brutal strength he had learned as a young man fighting on the docks. He grabbed the second lieutenant by the collar and slammed him into the wall, the sound of the impact echoing like a drum in the quiet restaurant. Sit down, Min-jae roared. His voice wasn't just loud, it was terrifying. It was the voice of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The other men froze, terrified. They had seen Min-jae angry before, but never like this. This wasn't business. This was personal. Min-jae stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, shielding Chioma with his own body. He looked at his fallen lieutenants with pure disgust. Daesham was on the floor, clutching his broken hand, his face twisted in pain and shock. You wanted to know how she speaks our language? Min-jae said, his voice dropping into that deep, gravelly Sadori dialect. He sounded like a storm rolling in over the ocean. She speaks it because she has more honor in her little finger than all of you have in your entire bodies. She speaks the language of my mother, a language of loyalty. And you speak the language of snakes. He stepped over to Daesham and looked down at him. You lied about Jeong. You tried to make me kill the only man who still remembers what it means to be a brother. You wanted him gone so you could turn this neighborhood into a playground for your greed. Daesham tried to speak, to offer one last lie, but Min-jae silenced him with a look. You told me to take care of the loose ends. Well, I'm taking care of them now. Min-jae turned to his bodyguards, who were standing by the entrance, unsure of what to do. Take these vipers out of my sight, he commanded. Strip them of their titles. Take their phones, their keys, and their pride. If I see any of them in this city tomorrow morning, make sure they never see another sunrise. That is my final order. The bodyguards moved quickly, grabbing the disgraced lieutenants and dragging them toward the back exit. The room, once filled with the heavy weight of a death sentence, suddenly felt lighter. The viper's nest had been cleared out. Min-jae turned to Chioma. He was still breathing hard, and his knuckles were bruised, but the madness in his eyes was gone. He looked at her and saw the bridge she had built with her words. He realized that by defending her, he had finally defended himself. He had protected his heritage, his home, and his soul. Are you hurt? He asked in Korean. His voice soft and full of the Jeong he had almost lost forever. Chioma shook her head. She looked at the mess in the dining room and then back at Min-jae. She wasn't afraid of the violence she had just seen because she knew it had been used to stop something much worse. I am fine, Mr. Park, she replied in the same dialect. The lion is finally awake. Min-jae looked around his empty restaurant. He was still a mafia boss, and he still had a dangerous life, but everything was different now. The blood on the floor was a sign of a new beginning, not just an end. He had used his power to save, not just to destroy. And as he stood there with Chioma, he knew that the impossible sound had done the one thing he thought was impossible. It had brought him home. The restaurant was quiet now, but it was the kind of quiet that follows a lightning strike. The air still felt heavy with the energy of what had just happened. Min-jae stood near the table, his eyes fixed on the door where his bodyguards had just dragged the lying lieutenants away. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. For years, he had been looking for enemies in the shadows of other gangs and police stations, never realizing that the real rot was sitting right next to him, eating his food and drinking his wine. A few minutes later, the back door opened again. His most trusted security team walked in, pushing 3 men forward. These weren't the lieutenants from the table. These were the men who worked in the dark corners of the organization, the ones who handled the money and the secret messages. They looked terrified, their faces pale and their knees shaking. Min-jae's lead guard stepped forward and dropped a stack of burner phones and a thick envelope on the table. We found these in their lockers, boss, the guard said, his voice steady. They were planning to call the police the moment the hit on Jeong was finished. They weren't just trying to kill a traitor. They were trying to hand you over so they could take over the city with a new partner. Min-jae looked at the phones. He didn't even need to open them. He could see the truth now as clearly as the moon in a dark sky. If he had followed his old rules and ignored the waitress, he would have been arrested or killed by morning. He would have murdered his best friend, Jeong, and then walked right into a trap set by the very people he had protected. He realized with a jolt that his life hadn't been saved by a gun or a fast car. It had been saved by a few words spoken in a dialect from a tiny fishing village. He turned toward Chioma, who was standing by the edge of the light. She looked at the captured men with a calm sadness. She wasn't happy to see them caught. She just seemed relieved that the truth was finally out in the open. Min-jae realized that in one single night, this woman had done more than save his life. She had saved his soul from becoming something he could never come back from. She had stopped him from becoming a man who murdered his brothers for a lie. You were right about everything, Min-jae said softly, walking over to her. He didn't look like a scary boss anymore. He looked like a man who had finally woken up from a long, bad dream. They didn't just want Jeong. They wanted to destroy the only parts of me that were still human. He looked at the men being held by his guards and gave a simple wave of his hand. Take them away. They are never to step foot in this neighborhood again. Let them see what life is like without the protection of the man they tried to betray. As the room cleared out, Min-jae felt the cold stone that had been in his chest for 20 years finally break into pieces. He thought about how Moni and the lessons Chioma had shared about honor and language being the home of the soul. He had spent so much time building walls to keep people out, but Chioma had used a bridge to get back in. He realized that being a leader wasn't about who feared him most, it was about who he was willing to protect. He looked at Chioma and gave a small, respectful bow, the kind of bow a younger person gives to a teacher. It was a gesture of pure Jeong, the deep bond that connects people through shared history and heart. Tonight, you reminded me of the boy I used to be, he said in their shared dialect. I can never repay you for that, but I promise you this, as long as I am in this city, you and your family will never have to worry about a fire or a bully ever again. Chioma smiled, and the warmth of it seemed to fill the entire room. She had come into the restaurant to serve tea, and she was leaving having saved an empire from itself. The truth was finally unveiled, and for the first time in his life, Park Min-jae wasn't just a boss. He was a man who was finally going home. A few months had passed, and the Golden Dragon restaurant felt like a completely different world. The air no longer smelled like fear or cold secrets. Instead, it was filled with the delicious scent of spicy soup and the sound of people laughing. The dark, heavy curtains had been pulled back to let in the glow of the city lights, and the restaurant was busier than it had ever been. People from all over the neighborhood came there now, knowing it was a place where they were safe and welcome. Park Min-jae sat at the same mahogany table where he had once plotted a murder, but his posture was different. He wasn't leaning into the shadows anymore. His black suit was still sharp, but he had unbuttoned his jacket, and his face looked years younger. He was no longer the dragon of the West who ruled by making people tremble. He had become a protector, a man who used his power to make sure the small shops in the area could keep their doors open without being bullied. Next to him sat Jeong, whose burns had healed into faint scars on his arms. They weren't talking about hits or money. They were talking about the soccer game from the night before and the new trust fund Min-jae had started for the local school. Jeong was the one leading the new organization now, one built on the old ways of honor and loyalty that they had almost forgotten. The sound of soft footsteps approached the table, and Min-jae looked up. Chioma was there, dressed in her neat uniform, carrying a steaming pot of tea. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the heart of the restaurant and a close friend to the man everyone used to fear. She poured the tea with a steady hand, and as the steam rose, she caught Min-jae's eye. "The tea is just the way you like it, Mr. Park," she said, speaking in that beautiful, rolling dialect of his home. Min-jae didn't respond with a cold nod or a silent stare. Instead, he did something his men hadn't seen him do in decades. He smiled. It was a real, warm smile that reached his eyes. He looked at Chioma and felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that he still had a difficult job and that there would always be dangers in his world. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had found a new kind of family, and he had finally kept the promise of his heritage. As Chioma walked away to help another customer, Min-jae took a sip of the warm tea. He looked around the thriving restaurant and realized that the impossible sound had been the greatest gift he had ever received. It had brought him back from the darkness and shown him that even a broken heart can heal when it finds its way home. The new syndicate wasn't built on blood. It was built on the words of a grandmother and the bravery of a woman who wasn't afraid to speak the truth. For the first time in his life, Park Min-jae was exactly where he was meant to be.